Hey, good afternoon, everyone. Thanks for joining us. We're going to get started in just a moment. Today's webinar is on Laudato Si. I'm here with Michael Downs, as well as two of his students joining us today. So thanks so much, Michael, for your time today. Feel free to let us know where you're watching from in the chat box. And as questions come to mind, feel free to put those in the Q&A. Okay, we'll be recording this webinar. So it'll be available on demand shortly after this webinar ends. So we hope you find it helpful. And if so, please feel free to share with your friends and colleagues. Okay. So like I mentioned, feel free to leave your comments in the chat. And if you have specific questions, we encourage you to use the Q&A rather than the chat box so we know what questions you'd like us to address. And there'll be a survey towards the end of the webinar, so we appreciate your feedback. And we encourage you to fill that out if you're interested in a certificate of attendance for today's webinar. Okay, so with that, I will pass it off to Michael Downs today to kick us off in prayer. Thanks so much for joining us.
Thank you so much, Jonathan, and welcome everyone. Really a privilege to be with you today as we discuss care for our common home and explore what your Laudato Si action plan might be. Again, my name is Michael Downs. I serve as Director of Justice and Kinship at Bishop O'Dowd High School in Oakland, California, a school which has a rich legacy of leadership at the intersection of ecology, spirituality, and justice. I also serve on the California Catholic Conference Environmental Stewardship Committee and the Laudato Si Action Platform Working Group for Schools. I'd also like to introduce two students who are joining me today.
Hi, my name is Namix Lusteva. I'm a senior here at Bishop O'Dowd, and I'm also part of the Eco Leadership team.
Hi, my name is Frances Park-Stefskel. I am also a senior and part of the Eco Leader team.
So I'm assuming everyone in this room has somehow had their heart or mind moved by Laudato Si. So I thought we'd begin with a brief reflection that comes from my favorite passage from that groundbreaking encyclical on the environment. Pope Francis writes, "The entire material universe speaks of God's love, his boundless affection for us. Soil, water, mountains, everything is, as it were, a caress of God. The history of our friendship with God is always linked to particular places which take on an intensely personal meaning. We all remember places, and revisiting those memories does us much good. Going back to these places is a chance to recover something of our true selves." So this time of year, I know it's very stressful and busy as educational leaders. So I want to invite everyone just to pause and actually consider what your particular place is, a place in creation you go to restore yourself. And if you're comfortable, just for a minute, closing your eyes and revisiting memories of that place, the sights, the sounds, the smells, and see if you can ground yourself in your true self before we begin. So God of love, creator of all, in the wake of Thanksgiving, we continue to give thanks, especially for these places in the natural world that bring us home to you and to ourselves. We give you thanks for this conversation, this collaboration. We ask for the courage to respond to your call to care for our common home. And we begin this conversation in your good and holy name. Amen. So before you hear briefly about our particular places, I'd love for you to drop in the chat, if you're comfortable, what place came to mind for you. I know we have many areas of the country represented on this call. So if you feel comfortable dropping in the chat your particular place, we'd love to see where you go. As you're jotting those in, here's a glimpse of my particular place. This is on the Continental Divide in Western Montana, just above a cabin my dad and uncles built when I was a kid. And between a flowery meadow and an aspen grove is this mighty pine tree, which at some point was struck by lightning. So it's almost cut in half, and yet continues to thrive as a sign of resilience and a home for hawks and elk, and a place I go to recover something of my true self.
Again, my name is Frances Parks Seskell, and a place I'm grateful for is the Oakland Redwoods. I've lived in Oakland all my life, and I've been hiking in the redwood since I could walk up a hill. It has been the place where I track the development of my passion for the environment, and the redwoods have been a consistent place of mental and physical restoration for me. Whenever I hike, I always look forward to going down into the heart of the forest and traversing next to the stream. As I descend, the setting changes from a tangled, beautiful oak forest to a mass of ancient towering redwoods. The light filters through the trees and gives the forest a mystical feel. This is a place where I feel my soul come alive and is filled with memories from my childhood and reminds me of the beauty present in the natural world.
I'm grateful for Bishop O'Dowd's campus, specifically the Living Lab, which you will be hearing more about later on. Whenever I'm down at the Living Lab, I truly feel at home with the surrounding environment. I love to walk around and smell the various plants and the sweet air. I also just love this area on campus because I can see all of Oakland. This is where I'm able to reflect on everything that's going on in life, and being able to see Oakland from the Living Lab reminds me of so many positive memories from my childhood, and this easily makes my day 10 times better. I'm also of Native descent and started the Native Indigenous Alliance Club. So I want to recognize that our campus, Bishop O'Dowd, lies on Ohlone land. We give thanks and appreciation to the Chochenyo and Karkin Ohlone nations, and we recognize that the Native people of these lands are still here today, and we give thanks to their continued role in protecting all life on this land. Here on the screen, you can see this is the native.ca website, and here you can find which native land you're on. And so I would definitely look into that.
Before we start, we also want to give a context and acknowledgement. I'm actually named after St. Francis of Assisi. My mom visited Assisi when she was pregnant with me and fell in love with the name. And St. Francis inspires our canticle of creation and the Laudato, and Pope Francis's Laudato Si in our school to make charism a commitment to kinship with creation. At O'Dowd, kinship with creation manifests as a school-wide effort for sustainability across our campus, curriculum, community, and culture. We aim to equip students, faculty, staff, and the greater community with the tools and experiences to create an environmentally sustainable, socially just, and economically viable world. We also acknowledge the context of our world and the anthropogenic impacts on the environment. Climate change is an issue that cannot be ignored. As you can see in this picture, it is not a picture of the future, it is actually a picture of the present. And our generation is pressured to act now so that future generations can live in prosperity. Also, I would like to bring attention to the recent COP26 conference in which world leaders came together to enable and encourage countries affected by climate change to protect and restore ecosystems, build resilient infrastructure, and implement sustainable agriculture to avoid the loss of homes, livelihoods, and even lives.
Along with acknowledging the land that we are on and the time that we are in, I also just want to acknowledge the privilege that I myself am experiencing, being at a school with a very rich legacy of work in environmental education. I'm privileged to be at a school that prioritizes this, that gives resources to it, that cultivates amazing student leaders like Nami and Francis. And I know that those givens are not givens in all Catholic schools, so I just wanted to name that up front. I also want to name the fact that as the primary presenter, I own the unearned privilege of being a middle-aged white cisgender, straight, Catholic American male. And if those privileges create blind spots in our presentation today, I really invite your honest feedback at the end. So today's objectives are in some ways simple, but kind of profound. The first is to understand the implications of the IPCC report released in August and COP26, which just finished earlier this month, the implications for you as educational leaders. The second objective is to learn the what, the why, and the how of the recently launched Laudato Si Action Platform. And then finally, most importantly, our hope is that you'll be inspired to take concrete action in your own school and community. So if you haven't had a chance to read it, I encourage you to do so because it touches every sector of society, especially education. The UN Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change released its 6th assessment report earlier this fall. These are 3 of the main takeaways. One is that global warming is unequivocally caused by humans. And I know some of you are in regions of the country where climate denial is still very real, but science has spoken. Second takeaway is that the impacts of climate crisis are already here, as we saw in the image that Francis shared. And these impacts are disproportionately impacting low-income, Black, Indigenous, and communities of color. That hits close to home for us as we look down from our campus hilltop to the realities of poverty and racism and environmental degradation in East Oakland. And the third primary takeaway from the IPCC is that temperatures have already increased by over a degree since 1880 and will continue to the 1.5 C mark in the next 20 years because of what has already happened. I also just want to share a few quick takeaways from the recent COP event in Glasgow, Scotland, which by many measures was a disappointment and yet a call to action. If we can't depend on governmental leaders to do kind of the radical and bold work necessary, it does call upon other sectors, including education. So 3 implications for educational leaders. One is that educational leaders need to see themselves as environmental and climate leaders. 2 is that climate leaders need to work more generously and collaboratively with K-12 educators. And thirdly, there's a growing call for significant funding and investment to support K-12 sustainable and resilient transition. We know you're in this business because you love young people and you're tuned into the adverse childhood experiences that might inform or deform their developmental thriving. What might be new to you is that, historically, when we speak about adverse childhood experiences, we usually talk about 2 realms, household experiences and community experiences. But what developmental psychologists are highlighting is that more and more students are having environmental adverse childhood experiences. And wherever you are in the country, if it's not already taking place, it likely will in the next few decades. It's worth noting that there is broad public support in the US for climate ed. 80% of parents and 86% of teachers thinks that climate change should be taught and discussed. 78% of all adults believe that schools should teach about it. Unfortunately, only 42% of teachers report that it's part of their curriculum. We know that climate change is already impacting students' well-being, social, emotional health. 57% of teens said that climate change makes them feel afraid. About the same amount say it makes them feel motivated. Yet only half of teens say they have learned little or nothing about how to reduce the effects of climate change in school. So the need is there, but students are telling us they want more understanding, knowledge, and experience from their educational leaders. Youth are already leading movements for climate action and climate justice. A couple years ago, when this really came to a head at a global climate strike, about 25% of teens in the US reported being engaged in some way. 32% of Gen Z report taking action in the past year in spite of the pandemic. And this call to action is not just for businesses and fossil fuel companies, it's for schools to do more. 2 years ago, we had student leaders, the predecessors of Nami and Francis, mobilize 400 of our students to skip school and march in the streets of San Francisco, demanding bold climate action. And the next day, as I was reflecting with pride on those students, because I marched with them, and skimming the New York Times for images around the world of young people like them taking action, I had kind of a conversion moment when I saw the picture of San Francisco. In the foreground was one of my students. Ludwig was a Chinese foreign exchange student who had never had the opportunity to learn about climate change, much less participate in activism in his native country, China. And for him was a real opening of mind and heart. But as I looked beyond Ludwig, I realized the boy at the center of this image was my son, Isaiah. And yes, that's my head. And what hit me here was, as a teacher, I think I was carrying some intellectual curiosity and some pride in my students. But when I realized that, the center of this global conversation was my own children, it definitely moved from my head into my heart and into my gut. And that's part of the why of my work in this. That's why I'm here with you today. It's why I was on a phone call at 4 a.m. with the Vatican and Jill from NCEA, because I think there's no more important work right now. And it makes me wonder, what is your why? What is your why of this work? Scientific and spiritual leaders alike are demanding nothing short of a paradigm shift. And the reason this is relevant to educational leaders comes from both science and spirituality as well. On the left, there's a quote from a science professor who said, this planetary emergency is really a crisis of mind, a crisis of mind. Therefore, it's a crisis of institutions which purport to improve minds. This is a crisis of institutions which purport to improve minds, namely schools. Pope Francis echoes this in Laudato Si, saying that we need deep change, and our efforts at education will be inadequate and ineffectual unless we strive to promote a new way of thinking. We strive to promote a new way of thinking. So some of the resources I'll make available after this webinar invite us to think about what paradigm shift looks like from a school setting, a place where we do have the privilege and responsibility to help mold behavior change, which affects cultural mindset change, which eventually affects policy change. So I'd like to turn our attention to one way we can cultivate this paradigm shift, one way we can make our schools centers of sustainability and environmental justice, and that's through the Laudato Si Action Platform. Here's a glimpse at sort of the journey that's been going since Laudato Si was published in May of 2015. And here we are in November of 2021, where an action plan is officially being launched at the request of the Pope. And all of us, by virtue of working at Catholic institutions, are invited to discern a 7-year journey towards sustainability and integral ecology. Nami and Francis are going to help us unpack the what and the why and the how of the Laudato Si Action Platform.
So first, we're going to talk about Laudato Si Action Platform why. Together, we are walking the road to integral ecology, which emphasizes the deep connections between our relationships with each other, our creator, and all creation. These connections have frayed, which has given the rise to an ever hotter and dirtier world, increasing the risks of hunger, thirst, sickness, conflict, and migration, a risk that the most vulnerable among us bear unjustly. Laudato Si, Pope Francis's encyclical on our common home, gave the voice to these concepts, putting the ancient teachings of our faith in new light for today's ecological crisis. The Vatican's Dicastery for Promoting Integral Human Development, in partnership with hundreds of Catholic organizations and subject matter experts, has developed a common platform to help the Universal Catholic act on this teaching. The Laudato Si Action Platform, which launched November 14th, though the initial registration period runs from Earth Day in April, we are hopeful that many of your institutions will sign up soon. The aim of LSAP is to listen and respond to the cry of the earth, the cry of the poor, and the cry of our children and future generations. Our prayer and dream is to initiate a people's movement from below that can really bring about the radical change needed given the urgency of our crisis of our common home. We hope to create the critical mass needed for societal transformation.
So now we're going to go into what of the LSAP. The Laudato Si Action Platform is an action-oriented 7-year ecological conversion journey in the spirit of integral ecology intended to support and empower families, communities, and institutions to achieve total sustainability. The 7-year journey is grounded in the 7 goals, which call for a spiritual and cultural revolution to realize full sustainability in the holistic spirit of integral ecology. The Laudato Si goals are as follows: responding to the cry of the earth and the cry of the poor, ecological economics, adoption of sustainable lifestyles, environmental education, ecological spirituality, and community resilience and empowerment. I am grateful to attend a school that has just registered for Laudato Si Action Platform. We hope your school does the same. For some inspiration, we want to share what our students and staff have been up to through the lens of the 7 goals of LSAP. The hope is that their work can inform and inspire you, not intimidate or overwhelm you. Everything you see has been student imagined, student initiated, student supported, but also critically supported by school leaders like you, who are compelled by the passion of these students and the moral mandates of Laudato Si.
So the first goal is responding to the cry of the earth, which is a call to protect our common home for the well-being of all, as well as equitably address the climate crisis, biodiversity loss, and ecological. For example, at Bishop O'Dowd, we have transformed a 4-acre wasteland of weeds and garbage, pictured in 2000 on the left, into a certified wildlife habitat and outdoor learning space lovingly called the Living Lab, which you can see last year on the right. As a platform for experiential multidisciplinary learning, the Living Lab not only engages students with topics such as ecology and food systems, it also provides a peaceful setting for contemplative practice, meditation, and written observation. This experiential space, along with the integration of sustainability throughout our school culture, creates a school where students are invited to be informed, passionate caretakers of the natural world and all of its inhabitants.
The second goal is the response to the cry of the poor. This is a call to promote eco-justice, or that we are called to defend human life from conception to death and all forms of life on earth. For example, at Bishop O'Dowd, we have partnered with various local public schools, nonprofits, and agencies serving communities who are disproportionately impacted by climate disruption. Last year, when our local public schools were closed, our students used compost made on campus to create garden starter kits for 7,000 families who were experiencing food insecurities. Furthermore, we partnered with this community garden in East Oakland, Canticle Farm, to combat poverty and environmental injustice.
So the third goal is ecological economics. Ecological economics acknowledges that the economy is a subsystem of human society, which itself is embedded within the biosphere, our common home. For example, at O'Dowd, we as an institution continually work to reduce our resource consumption and our greenhouse gas emissions, and to purchase food, apparel, and other goods as sustainably as possible. Campus infrastructure includes the award-winning LEED Platinum Center for Environmental Studies, which is equipped with solar panels and a rainwater catchment system. It provides an educational model for sustainable design. In tandem with goal number 3 is the adoption of sustainable lifestyle. It is grounded in the idea of sufficiency and promoting simplicity in the use of resources and energy. At O'Dowd, we integrate lessons on the culture of waste and responsible tri-bin waste sorting into the student orientation programs. We encourage students to live more simply, have reusable water bottle stations, and eliminated plastic utensils. We bring food from the school garden to the cafeteria and cafeteria waste to our compost system. We also sought LEED certification from our 2 new gymnasiums.
The fifth goal is ecological education. This is about rethinking and redesigning circular and institutional reform in the spirit of integral ecology in order to foster ecological awareness and transformative action. For example, here at Bishop O'Dowd, we have transformed our freshman experience to include lessons in environmental justice and integral ecology. Every freshman will be grounded in cutting-edge climate science in their first year science and the environment class through a multifaceted reflection on the story, spiritual significance, and demise of salmon. Reflect on the cry of the earth and poor in their Hebrew scriptures lessons in Genesis, quantify the impacts of environmental injustices in their math class, learn about the connection to land while reading of Mice and Men, and spend at least 10 hours in service to our common home, half being on campus and half being off campus. Building off the freshman foundation of science and the environment, students can take a peace and justice class featuring units on environmental justice and AP environmental science courses. We are deepening the integration in other subjects as well. One project that both Francis and I worked on recently was organizing a school-wide community action day. We got students engaged with environmental justice and educated them on their impact on the environment. We brought a panelist to the school to talk about environmental issues in Oakland. We even got the chance to learn from Oakland Council member Trevor Reed about various nonprofits that support this.
Goal number 6 discusses ecological spirituality. Ecological spirituality springs from a profound ecological conversion and helps us to discover God in all things, both in the beauty of creation and in the sighs of the sick and the groans of the afflicted. Aware that the life of the spirit is not disassociated from worldly realities. At O'Dowd, we send students on a Kairos retreat to the beautiful natural setting of a Franciscan retreat center. Incentivize teachers to have lunch outside, co-create outside prayer and memorial services, and construct sites for spiritual contemplation and meditation. Next semester, I actually will be taking a senior religious studies elective called Spiritual Ecology, which explores the intersection between the environment and spirituality.
The seventh goal is community resilience and empowerment. This envisions a journey of community engagement and participatory action on various levels. Here at O'Dowd, we leverage our leadership to host conferences in spiritual ecology and environmental justice. We send our students to local, state, and national political offices to advocate for the earth and the poor. We participate in marches and climate strikes, like Mr. Down mentioned earlier. We write letters to Congress and partner with local nonprofits at the service of our common home and those community members disproportionately impacted by climate change. I recently attended the Ignatian Family Teach-In for Justice, where I presented a workshop on Native American justice, which in many aspects relates to environmental justice and spiritual ecology. Additionally, part of this journey was learning how to lobby and meeting with council members.
So thank you so much, Nami and Francis. You did a great job of sharing the Laudato Si Action Platform through the lens of these 7 goals and some concrete examples of what we've been doing at our school. And I just want to name, for the folks on this call, wherever you are on this sustainability journey, if you've been doing this for years or you're just getting, your feet wet, the LSAP offers all kinds of tools and resources in the hopes that you will join this journey, trusting that you and your students and staff are really the experts of your particular place, and that God has given your community unique gifts alone that you can bring to this shared project, building a better future. There's lots of ways to engage, and these will all come in a follow-up email via the NCEA, but one is that schools have found leveraging church authority can be useful. This is a letter that Cardinal Turkson wrote on behalf of the Dicastery for Integral Human Development asking all school leaders to really engage this process. This is the actual Laudato Si Action Platform website, which we'll explore here together. But it's become quite user-friendly, full of resources, again, depending on wherever you are on your journey. And the guide that's here for schools, which I'll send you after the meeting, was collaboratively developed and is one of the many tools offered in the spirit of helpfulness. But again, you're encouraged to use it to whatever extent it's useful, and not when it's not. So there's really 3 phases to the journey of the Laudato Si Action Platform after you've established what your context is and reflected on your school's own experience. You've heard a bit about our context and our experience. So the 3 movements, which might sound familiar from other Catholic kind of reflection paradigms, are reflection, action, and evaluation. These are the actual steps in the Laudato Si journey. So reflection begins with sort of a baseline evaluation of your school, reflecting on your school's unique gifts or mission or charism. You heard that our charism actually includes the phrase kinship with creation. And then some communal discernment around the processes and steps that you might take. Of course, the next movement is action, and there'll be lots of proposed and suggested actions, but the idea is each school community discerns its own annual plan of bold but doable goals, and then to implement those actions. And then thirdly, every year, a chance to reflect on your institutional progress, to complete an annual self-assessment, which gets shared with the LSAP platform, and then discern sort of the next year's goals. To remain committed as a Laudato Si school, there's only 3 things requested. So those of you thinking like students of like, what's the homework or what's demanded of us? It's simply to complete an annual self-assessment. It's not sort of graded by any external body. It's really for your own your school's self-reflection. Second thing is to upload a reflection on how the values of the school are manifest and connected to Laudato Si. And then thirdly is to upload your annual plan that includes target outcomes and actions you'll take for that coming year. So the 7 goals of the Laudato Si Action Platform is one frame that we're finding very useful. I wanted to share, before we get to Q&A, a couple other frames that we at ODOUT have found really useful. And one is the 4 C's of whole school sustainability and climate resiliency. The 4 C's being campus, curriculum, community, and culture. And you can see how the different aspects of your school community and different stakeholders come to play through those 4 C's. Here's an example of how it's played out at one particular school, Bishop O'Dowd High School in Oakland. On campus, you can see we're talking about infrastructure, facilities, and operations, and getting our CFO and our facilities manager and our creation care team and custodians on board, for example. The second C, curriculum, has for us initiated a lot of conversations across departments. And we're finding that within each department, there are people who are already passionate about the environment and willing to explore and pilot ways of integrating these concepts, regardless of their subject. Community is about both internally and externally facing. How do we engage around sustainability topics, lifestyle choices, and events? Francis and Nami helped organize a really wonderful Harvest Day festival and Halloween, where our living lab became haunted and kids were painting faces and pumpkins and learning about sustainability. And in a couple weeks, in preparation for Christmas, for example, they'll have a DIY craft celebration where kids use natural elements to create Christmas gifts and minimize waste. And finally, the final C is around culture. Your mission, your charism, your outcomes, how decisions are made, what values are at play at the different kind of circles of influence. So just to give you an example of what that might look like, because I honor that the people on this call are coming from very different cultural contexts. So just like the hot sauce that we make in our living lab, you might be at sort of a mild, medium, or spicy level of engagement. So for example, a mild step in terms of campus change might be just to set one goal of reducing carbon emissions. A medium step might be to do a more robust facility assessment. And a spicy goal might be actually designing a living schoolyard. Outdoor education has really had a boom during COVID because there's been so much exploring of outdoor ed as the way through and beyond the pandemic.
So the next one is curriculum. A mild step that could be taken is providing professional learning opportunities for faculty that focus on how to integrate the environmental principles and concepts into each subject area. A medium would be integrating lessons and activities that expose students to the green economy. And a spicy would be integrating lessons and activities that help students obtain skills that will prepare them for the green economy.
For community and culture, a mild heat would be to put climate change on the agenda for your next meeting and invite faculty and staff to share their hopes and fears about the climate crisis. And for a medium level, one can welcome youth climate activism and invite speakers from youth climate movements and climate movement organizations. And a spicy level would be to include climate change and environmental justice into already existing efforts around diversity, equality, and inclusion.
So we'll happily share all of these links related to a framework of the 4 Cs, which again, we found really useful at our school, and a lot of other California schools have used this. I also want to highlight briefly some other frameworks coming out of the Catholic world. This image comes from the Ignatian sort of family of schools run by the Jesuit order. And it uses this metaphor that we found really compelling about, with a problem this daunting, your individual efforts might feel like just kind of a drop in the ocean, right? But what we're finding is when those drops come together, they form a stream. When those streams come together, they form a river. When those rivers come together, they form kind of a mighty tide that can break down the systems and structures of the rocks, so to speak, that are holding us back. Also from the Ignatian world is an invitation for reflection and action for the various stakeholders of a given school community. So all the way from the individual through students, faculty, administration, governing boards, families, and alumni. We'll share out some resources to get them engaged, thinking about this, praying about this, and then committing to action. So these frameworks I've shared, the LSAP goals, the 4 Cs, the mild, medium, spicy lists, and the Ignatian sort of reflection action paradigm are just a few different ways that you might consider bringing integral ecology, sustainability, and environmental justice to life on your campus. But what I wanted to move towards is some conversation. And before we have conversation, some suggested steps and one last story. This is an all hands on deck moment, as you know, and I think we're finding that our work is the most successful when we're willing to engage other schools, public and private. We're willing to engage other sectors of this movement, whether they're Catholic or not. And so these are some tips from the broader environmental movement around what educational leaders can do right now. One is continue to learn. Is this book on your shelf? Is this a kind of news story that you're following, et cetera? To embrace change-making leadership, to integrate sustainability and climate resiliency into your leadership philosophy, not to mention your strategic planning, to invest in systemic change, because that's really what's being called for. It's not just about, adding a recycle bin, it's about changing our relationship to things. And finally, as adults, dealing with young people who will bear the brunt of the climate crisis, to have the courage and the humility to accept and reject, when applicable, the responsibility of the time we're in. Some next steps we'd invite you to consider and share broadly in your networks of other educational leaders. One is think about who in your own school, or for you superintendents, who in your own diocese could be Laudato Si leaders. And I added co because we're finding that when there's at least a couple people engaged, you can get a lot more leverage and traction. And we're also finding that these ideas come to life when there's someone on campus who's really championing it, who's really driving it. And we're starting to see some schools creating positions where this is explicitly part of the role. For example, my role as Director of Justice and Kinship is only 2 years old, and it's derived from an institutional decision to make kinship with creation a programmatic priority. The second invitation would be to actually enroll your school or diocese for the Laudato Si Action Platform. It's a pretty user-friendly interface. It does take about 30 to 60 minutes to complete the enrollment process. There are some bits of data you need to have ahead of time, like if you have it, how much energy you use, how much water you use, have you planted trees, are there already some programs going on at your school, et cetera. So you need to do a little bit of internal research before you apply. But just to be clear, the launch happened November 14th and continues until Earth Day, which is April 22nd of 2022. And the hope is that everyone who signed up during that window of launch uploads their first proposed plan by September 1st, which is the beginning of the season of creation. A few other steps would be to keep an eye out for the new YouTube documentary Laudato Si, which comes out early in 2022 and has already had critical acclaim as a teaching tool. And finally, discern and commit to your first year goal by Earth Day. That said, since you're here, I'm presuming that we have some early adopters in the room. So the sooner you can get your school enrolled, the better. And it gives us a lot more leverage and traction as we promote more broadly in our regions, in our nation, and across the globe. I want to close with a story and then open up to your questions. You know, if you spent some time in this world, it can feel daunting. It can feel like there's so much to lose. But for me, I had a little paradigm shift in my relationship to this work. Just 2 weeks ago, Nami and I were in Washington, D.C. for the largest Catholic social justice conference of the year, which is the Ignatian Family Teaching for Justice. She was speaking about indigenous spiritual practices. I was speaking about Laudato Si. And we met this young man who had been hunger striking on the front steps of the White House for weeks with some of his friends, demanding bold climate policy. And when asked why he was doing what he was doing, he said, because I went to Catholic schools, because I learned to listen to the cry of the earth, the cry of the poor, because I learned about human dignity and the common good and the preferential option for the poor, and stewardship, et cetera. So his why for being there was because of he went to one of your schools. And when someone said to him, but doesn't it feel daunting? There's so much to lose. And he said, but there's so much to win. There's so much to win. So I love that. And it helped me over the last few weeks think about the wins that are happening. So I wanted to close sharing some of the wins that we're building off. In our own state, just a few months ago, the legislature approved $6 million to make climate change and environmental justice curriculum universal. And that is connected to some of the work that we're doing. Laudato Si has actually been referenced in the California state legislature. And I'm partnering with some of the public school leaders in that space to make that kind of education universal. The second big win is this Laudato Si Action Plan was launched and is already making headlines and gaining traction. And one other win was the NCEA generously invited us to share a feature article in last month's Momentum, which I encourage you to check out to learn more about our work. And we're so grateful for the NCEA for making this work a priority going forward. One last win is we are about to develop a California Laudato Si hub of free resources, programs, and community-based partnerships for all Catholic schools in the state. And again, this will be a curricular resource with thousands of vetted plans to give schools and teachers the tools they need to integrate this in a natural way, in a meaningful way that's scientifically sound, but also spiritually reflective. Individuals who receive 1 year of intensive climate change education made individual decisions which resulted in a reduction of 2.86 tons of CO2 per year. So we also know that education leads to habit change, and habit change leads to mindset change, and mindset change can change the world. So as we close, I encourage you to continue to reflect on what do you have to win, and what is one of the next steps you could take on this Laudato Si journey from wherever you're beginning. Thank you so much for your time and attention. We're really grateful to be here, and would like to open up the floor to questions or comments. I'll check the chat, but Jonathan, if you want to help facilitate that, or if the group's small enough, we could just open it up.
Feel free to add your questions in the Q&A, and if you have comments, we encourage you to use the chat box. We'll be putting a link to the webinar survey in the chat as well. So please, if you're interested in a certificate of attendance, especially, we encourage you to complete that. I see Jill posted a link to the NCA Momentum article that Michael contributed. So we encourage you to check that out. And Hannah asks, how does one get involved in being part of the team that worked with the LSAP?
Great question. And I assume she means the folks working on kind of the global platform. If that's the case, Hannah, you could follow up with me, or also with Jill, who is part of the NCEA leadership and on this call. We're both in that schools working group. I think it's sort of an invitation only setting because it's a global thing. But I know they're looking to expand that working group list going forward. And something that hasn't been established yet, but I hope would be sort of more regional working groups, whether it's by country or even by region. And we'd be happy to talk with you about making that happen.
Okay. Chris asks, how do you see your peers energized by this topic, and what do you do to encourage your peers to take more concrete action in this area?
Chris, is that for students or for adult peers?
I think that was mostly for the students.
So if you want, I can hit this one off really quickly. So I see my peers energized about this topic every day. We as eco leaders also have an eco club, and we always have an abundance of kids wanting to engage in the living lab during lunch or during their free periods. There's also a high enrollment in the AP Environmental Science class, probably the highest amount of students in any science class or AP Science class. So we can tell that a lot of kids are interested in learning about these topics. But I think the biggest one I wanted to touch on was what we do to encourage our peers to take more action in this area. And I just like to talk a little bit more about the Community Action Day that we facilitated. I personally was a core organizer on that day, and we encouraged our students to take action through leading them through action steps. So we kind of organized a multitude of student leaders to lead classrooms and lead students through action steps. And that would include, we wrote letters to the president. We signed up for phone banks. We encouraged students to download browsers that clean up the ocean. We encourage them to evaluate the sustainability of their action brands and sign up for volunteer opportunities. And I think that really mobilized our student body. I've talked to several students even before coming to this meeting, and they described that they always check the sustainability of their clothing brands even now, and still participate in the phone banks. And we did that through the Sunrise Movement Bay Area. That's the phone bank that we used. And also I look around after that action day and I see we use the browser Ocean Hero, and at least 40% of the computers up, I can see the browser Ocean Hero still on. And also I oftentimes receive comments about the panelists that we invited and how people now are actually volunteering with their organizations. So I think that, yeah. Nami, do you have anything to add?
I just want to, yeah, like Francis was saying, an emphasis on the Community Action Day. I feel like that day really just set in stone kind of our goals for the year and the following years and future students.
Thank you. Jonathan, other questions that are coming through?
So feel free to add any additional questions in the Q&A. And
I'm seeing about dealing with people who think that environmental concerns are fake. That's a really tough one, and it's heartbreaking to think that that's the role of misinformation having a direct impact on the health of our planet and our people. But I would say there's lots of really interesting climate psychology coming out, showing what's useful and not when dealing with people who deny the truth of climate change. And a couple nuggets, and then I'm going to share a resource document via Jonathan that'll have some specific articles, but a couple nuggets. One is they're finding that people that don't believe aren't really being moved by the science. They're not being moved by doomsday predictions. They're not even being moved by seeing things happening around the world. Unfortunately, some people aren't converted until it hits close to home, right? But two things that did seem to move people. One is a connection to story and to land. And if they're able to tune into how their own land or lifestyle is being impacted, that starts to turn it. The other thing that they found, we saw this at a conference at Creighton University, was well-informed middle schoolers were one of the most impactful factors for converting people who were climate deniers. Again, this puts pressure on schools, but if young people can speak, can talk science and talk about their future, that was one of the most impactful things for the uncles and aunts and grandparents who thought it's a hoax.
those are all the questions I'm seeing at the moment. If you have any other comments or questions, feel free to let us know. Once the webinar ends, you'll see the webinar survey that we encourage you to complete. You'll see a link to that in the chat box as well. Yeah, I'm not seeing any more questions come through. But Michael, did you have anything you'd like to add before we get ready to close today's webinar?
I did want to say how proud I am of the co-presenters. So Nami and Francis, thank you so much for the work that you do at our school and for taking time away from class to be with us. I want to extend a big thank you to Jonathan and Jill for the generous invitation, and also extend, to all of you in this room, our offer for collaboration and conversation and insights and resources. I think we've been richly blessed here, where we are geographically and culturally, and from whom much is given, much is expected. Jonathan, I did compile sort of a resource list of links. Would that be best channeled through you, or something I should just drop in the chat?
You could just you can share in the chat. It'd be great.
Okay.
Great. Well, thank you everyone for joining us today. We appreciate your time. And if you're interested in previous webinars or webinars that are coming up, we encourage you to head to nca.org/webinars. And we appreciate your feedback. So we'd love to hear your thoughts and recommendations by filling out the webinar survey. Great. Thanks everyone for joining us today, and have a blessed rest of your day.